the Ethiopian church took all of this literature, which included literature that nobody considered scripture at the time, and they appeared to have just been non-discretionary and included everything.
It's a new book making some shocking claims about the life of Jesus Christ. According to the Lost Gospel, Jesus married Mary Magdalene and they had 2 children.
A single page, parchment the color of old bone, edges frayed and curling. The script written across it is in Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, and the ink has faded to the brownish-gray of something that has been waiting a very long time. The page had not been translated, not in modern scholarship, not in any published commentary, not by anyone who had catalogued the monastery's collection. It had simply been sitting in a cliffside library in northern Ethiopia, wrapped in cloth on a stone shelf, in a room that smelled of centuries of candle smoke and very old paper, until someone finally unwrapped it. And when they did, they found a name attached to a man who appears in the Gospels for exactly 2 lines. A man released from a Roman prison so that Jesus could be crucified in his place. The Gospels give him those 2 lines and then erase him. No background, no family, no reason, just a function in someone else's story, and then silence. This page didn't erase him, and what it preserved, what it had been holding for more than 1,000 years in a rock-cut room above an Ethiopian valley, isn't just the story of one forgotten man. It's a thread, and when you pull it, something comes apart that the institutional church has kept stitched together for 1,700 years. Here is what you need to understand about the Ethiopian Bible, and you need to understand it quickly, because it changes everything that follows. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church uses a biblical canon of 81 books. The Protestant Bible has 66. The Catholic Bible has 73. Ethiopia has 81, and the extra books aren't minor additions or footnotes. And some of them are ancient enough to have been circulating before the canonical Gospels were written. Some were read, cited, and considered authoritative by the earliest Christians, and then voted out of the Bible at 4th century church councils. And some of them, critically, are still being translated for the first time. The Garima Gospels, kept at the Abba Garima Monastery in Tigray, have been carbon dated by researchers at Oxford to somewhere between 330 and 650 CE. That makes them the oldest surviving illustrated Christian manuscripts anywhere on Earth. They contain the 4 Gospels. They've been studied. They've been photographed. They're the famous ones. But the Abba Garima collection isn't the only monastery library in Tigray. There are dozens, and most of them haven't been fully catalogued. And you picture the monastery where this story begins. It sits further into the highlands than the famous one, in a region where the roads stop being roads and you continue on foot. The building itself is carved into the face of a cliff. The library, if you can call it that, is a series of rooms cut directly into the rock, the walls darkened from centuries of candle smoke, the air cool and heavy with the particular smell of very old parchment. Stone shelves line the walls. On them sit manuscripts wrapped in cloth, some of them with tags, some without. Some of the wrappings haven't been removed in living memory. The monks who tend the collection can read Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language in which everything is written. But translating it into any modern language requires a specialist, and specialists haven't always come. That changed. It incrementally over the last 2 decades. Teams of researchers began the slow, painstaking work of cataloging and photographing what the cliffside libraries held. Some of the collection is extraordinary. Some of it, researchers have said privately, is like nothing published anywhere in Western scholarship. The effort was severely disrupted when war came to Tigray in November 2020. The conflict that engulfed northern Ethiopia for 2 years caused documented, widespread damage to churches and monasteries across the region. 30 or more religious sites were heavily damaged or destroyed. From a single monastery in western Tigray, more than 3,000 parchment manuscripts were looted. Pages that had survived since the 6th century were photographed appearing for sale online for a few $100s. Monks were killed. Yes, a report from the Tigray Orthodox Church Diocese 3 months into the conflict found 326 members of the priesthood had been killed in that period alone. The manuscript cataloging effort was put on hold entirely. One researcher involved in the project stopped filing progress reports in late 2021. The team assumed it was the war. They still haven't received a complete account from that branch of the cataloging work. What has surfaced in the years since the ceasefire are fragments, individual pages, sections of texts that weren't previously documented. And in that slow, fragile process of reviewing what survived, a team working on the passion narrative sections of an unclassified Ethiopian manuscript found something that stopped the cataloging work completely. Not because of what the text said about Jesus, yet because of what it said about the man standing across from him. The man's name in the 4 canonical Gospels is Barabbas. That's it. No lineage, no occupation beyond the word prisoner, no family, no backstory. Mark describes him as someone who had committed murder in the insurrection. Luke says insurrection. John says he was a robber. Matthew calls him a notorious prisoner. The accounts don't entirely agree on what he did. They agree only that Pilate offered his release, that the crowd chose him, and that his release meant Jesus was sent to the cross instead. 2 paragraphs, then gone. His name, Barabbas, is Aramaic. Bar means son, Abba means father. So Barabbas, translated literally, means son of the Father. Theologians have written about that for centuries. The symbolism feels almost too neat. The Son of the Father released, the Son of God crucified. Some scholars have argued the parallel is intentional, that Barabbas functions symbolically rather than historically. But there is a detail that almost never makes it into Sunday sermons. Origen, one of the most significant scholars in the early church, writing in the 3rd century, examined the earliest manuscript copies he could access. And in those copies, the man's name wasn't just Barabbas, it was Jesus Barabbas, Jesus, Son of the Father. 2 men named Jesus standing before Pilate. Pilate asking the crowd, "Which Jesus do you want?" Origen was so disturbed by this that he wrote it must be a scribal error, that no sinful man could share the sacred name with the Lord. He argued the name away. And somewhere in the early centuries of transmission, most manuscript copies dropped the first name, just Barabbas. A Jesus Barabbas became simply Barabbas. Researchers at Tyndale House who have examined the manuscript evidence in detail have concluded that the original reading of Matthew 27:16-17 was almost certainly Jesus Barabbas. They believe scribes removed the name out of reverence, which means what most of us know as the Barabbas story is already a version of the story with a name deliberately removed. The Ethiopian page doesn't remove it. The Ethiopian text preserves the full name and then goes further. It gives him a patronymic, a father's name, a lineage. In this manuscript, Barabbas is not a one-line criminal inserted to provide narrative contrast. He is a man with a documented identity that connects him to a specific priestly family, a family with a history, a grievance, and a cause that the 4 canonical Gospels never once mention. So the team sat with the transcription for 2 full days before they decided what they were looking at was not a later addition, not a scribal embellishment, not a monk filling in a blank centuries after the fact. The handwriting analysis placed the passage in the same hand as the surrounding text. Same ink, same period, same scribe. It was original. It had always been there. They just hadn't looked. Outside the monastery walls, the wind off the highlands is cold. The valleys below the cliff face haven't changed in 1,000 years. The team didn't speak much that evening. To understand how a man's identity could disappear from the Gospels, you need to understand what happened in the 4th century, not as a conspiracy, but as a documented institutional decision. Yet the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is famous for resolving the question of Jesus' divine nature. Less famous is what followed. Decades of church councils working to formalize which texts were acceptable for reading in churches and which were not. The Council of Laodicea, held around 363 to 364 CE, produced an explicit list of permitted texts. The list was detailed.
This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez.
So was what it excluded: the Book of 1st Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the shepherd of Hermas. Texts that had been read, cited, and treated as authoritative by Christians for 300 years, dropped, not burned, not forbidden exactly, just removed from the canon. No longer scripture, no longer read in churches, and therefore, over generations, effectively forgotten, everywhere except Ethiopia. The Ethiopian church had received its scriptures in the 4th and 5th centuries, drawing from the broad Alexandrian and Syrian traditions, at a time before other canons had been formally closed. When the Council of Laodicea made its decisions, the Ethiopian church wasn't present. It wasn't subject to the council's authority. It kept what it had always had. Now here's the specific problem that the Ethiopian manuscript creates. The Book of Jubilees, which the Ethiopian text appears to cite as the source of the lineage attached to Barabbas, is an ancient retelling of Genesis and Exodus with expanded genealogies. It is sometimes called the Little Genesis. It was well known to early Christians. Origen cited it, Justin Martyr cited it, Epiphanius cited it. It names figures who are unnamed in the standard biblical text. It fills in family trees. It identifies who people were and where they came from. Its emphasis is on priestly lineages, who belonged to which priestly family, and what that meant. The complete text of Jubilees survives in full in only one language, Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia. Everywhere else, only fragments survive, pieces in Greek, in Latin, in Syriac, in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Only the Ethiopian church maintained the whole text, which means only the Ethiopian tradition had the full genealogical record that the manuscript appears to be drawing on when it names Barabbas's lineage. The skeptic case is straightforward. Ethiopian manuscripts were copied and recopied over many centuries. Later scribes added context. The lineage attached to Barabbas could be a medieval edition, a monk filling in a blank with a plausible name from a text he happened to know. It's a fair argument. Here is what complicates it. B. The handwriting analysis didn't just identify the passage as being in the same hand as the rest of the text. It suggested the scribe who wrote that section was working from a source. The phrasing and structure of the lineage section is consistent with citation, not composition. Whoever wrote it appears to have been copying something rather than inventing it. What they were copying from and when is what remains open. Here is the detail that stops you cold if you know the Gospels well. Every single Gospel agrees on the name Barabbas. They agree on the Passover offer. They agree that the crowd chose Barabbas over Jesus, but they disagree, quietly, consistently, on what kind of man Barabbas was. Mark says insurrectionist and murderer. Luke says insurrectionist only. John says robber. What Matthew says notorious prisoner without specifying why. 4 accounts. 4 different descriptions of the same man at the same moment. No single description is impossible, but the inconsistency suggests that the gospel writers were working from sources that didn't agree on Barabbas, because those sources weren't primarily about Barabbas. He wasn't the point. He was the contrast. The writers had enough information to make the scene work, and not much more. If you're finding this worth your time, a like genuinely helps this channel keep investigating these stories. Back to the manuscript. The Ethiopian text treats Barabbas differently. In the passage surrounding his name and lineage, the manuscript describes him not as a common criminal, but as a man imprisoned for his role in a specific event. One the text connects explicitly to the tensions between certain priestly families and the Roman administration. It doesn't romanticize him. He isn't a hero in this account, but it gives him a reason. And the reason it gives him lines up, in specific detail, with the political landscape of Jerusalem in the late 20s CE, as documented by Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, whose accounts are considered the most reliable non-biblical sources for this period. Josephus describes several uprisings during the Roman governorship of Pontius Pilate. He names participants. He names causes. He describes a Jerusalem in which the Sadducean priestly establishment and various opposition factions were in documented conflict, each with Roman authority watching from above. If the lineage in the Ethiopian manuscript is accurate, Barabbas wasn't a random criminal swept up in events. He was a participant in a specific conflict from a specific family with a specific position in the priestly politics of first-century Jerusalem. Then there's the additional line, a line found during a later pass through the translated section. The team almost missed it. It appears in a passage where water damage has obscured several words. What survived, translated from the Ge'ez, reads something like, "And this man had known the one who called people to the river, before any of these things came to pass." The one who called people to the river. That is not a description the Ethiopian scribe invented. That is a description consistent with John the Baptist, yet known across the Gospels precisely for calling people to the Jordan. If the text is what it appears to be, Barabbas and John the Baptist knew each other before any of this happened. That single line has received no public discussion. The team knows what it might mean. They haven't published it yet. Now comes the part nobody in the team anticipated. The lineage given to Barabbas in the Ethiopian manuscript includes his father's name. That name transliterated from the Ge'ez corresponds phonetically to a name that appears in a separate Ethiopian biblical text. Not the Passion narrative section, not the Book of Jubilees, but a different text entirely. An Ethiopian apocalyptic text called the Liber Mysteriorum Caeli et Terrae, the Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth. It is largely unstudied in Western scholarship. It has its own genealogies, its own named figures, its own internal world. The name appears in both texts. In the Liber Mysteriorum, the figure bearing this name comes from a family that had maintained a specific ritual responsibility in the Jerusalem temple, a responsibility connected to the Passover sacrificial rites. His lineage is priestly. His family had, according to the text, been in documented opposition to the Sadducean establishment for at least 2 generations. This matters because of who the Sadducees were. They controlled the temple. They controlled the high priesthood. They were also, according to all 4 Gospels and the Book of Acts, the faction most directly responsible for handing Jesus of Nazareth to Roman authority. If Barabbas came from a priestly family in documented opposition to the Sadducees, his release wasn't mercy. It wasn't the arbitrary outcome of a crowd's whim. It was a transaction that placed 2 specific factions on opposite sides of a Roman governor's decision. And one of those factions, the Sadducees, would have had reason to want it recorded a particular way, a way that removed the political logic, a way that made it look like a crowd acting on emotion, rather than a network acting on interest. One researcher on the translation team described the moment they cross-referenced the father's name across the 2 texts as the kind of thing that makes you stop typing. Not because it proves anything definitive, because it surfaces a question that the canonical Gospels, by stripping Barabbas of his identity, make impossible to ask. Who was Pilate actually negotiating with that day? Sure, the crowd's demand for Barabbas, was it as spontaneous as the Gospels suggest? Or was there a political logic running beneath the surface, documented in traditions that the Western Church voted out of its canon in 363 CE that the 4 evangelists chose not to preserve? The data supports the question. It doesn't answer it. There is a moment in the life of every ancient document when it stops being merely a text and becomes a problem. That moment arrived differently for different manuscripts. For the Dead Sea Scrolls, it arrived when scholars realized the texts described a Jewish community that looked, in several uncomfortable ways, like the early Christian movement, and predated it by a century. For the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, it arrived when the Gospel of Thomas turned out to preserve sayings of Jesus that had no parallel in the canonical texts. Some of those sayings looked more original, not less. For this Ethiopian page, that moment arrived quietly. A handwriting analysis, a lineage that cross-referenced, a name that appeared twice in 2 separate texts with consistent details. What it raises, and this is speculative territory, clearly marked as such, is a question about the Passion narrative that scholars have circled for decades without adequate textual material to address. If Jesus Barabbas was a real man with a real identity, a man whose priestly lineage placed him in documented opposition to the faction that handed Jesus of Nazareth to Rome, then the scene before Pilate was not a random crowd making an impulsive choice. It was the intersection of two very specific political networks, with two men sharing an identical first name, whose fates inverted at the moment of Pilate's question. One interpretation, held by a minority of scholars in Second Temple studies, is that the Passover custom of releasing a prisoner, which appears in no Roman or Jewish source outside the Gospels, may have been a narrative frame designed to explain a political transaction, not a custom, a negotiated outcome. And if the Ethiopian manuscript's lineage is accurate, the parties to that negotiation had identities, histories, and competing interests that the canonical Gospels, which once written primarily for Gentile audiences who didn't need the priestly politics of Jerusalem decoded for them, simply left out. Not deception, emphasis. The writers wrote for their audiences and gave them what they needed to understand the story they were telling. A second interpretation goes further. Some researchers who have worked with the Ethiopian canon argue that texts like the Book of Jubilees weren't excluded from the Western canon arbitrarily. They were excluded because they contained exactly the kind of traceable genealogical information that made simplified versions of certain narratives harder to sustain. Jubilees, specifically, preserves priestly lineages with enough granularity that cross-referencing its figures against the Gospel accounts creates complications. The 4th century councils were aware of this. The scholars of that period were not naive about the text's contents. Of course, there are simpler explanations. Canon formation is a messy, centuries-long process driven by liturgical use, geographical distribution, and theological coherence, not by coordinated suppression. Not everything that was excluded for political reasons. Most of it wasn't. But here is the documented fact that sits alongside those simpler explanations. The Book of Jubilees survives in its complete form in only one language, Ge'ez, the language of Ethiopia. Everywhere else, only fragments remain. And Ethiopia was the one Christian tradition that the Council of Laodicea's decisions never reached, not because Ethiopia was isolated, but because the Ethiopian church was already ancient by the time of those councils. It had its own apostolic tradition. It wasn't subject to the Roman or Byzantine church's authority. What Ethiopia kept, Rome discarded. And what Ethiopia kept, in this particular case, appears to include the full identity of a man who stood before Pilate in the same week as Jesus, with the same first name, with a traceable family, with a documented reason for being exactly where he was. He wasn't erased by fire. There's no dramatic moment of suppression to point to. He was erased the way anything disappears from institutional memory, by omission, by not including the context that would have made him make sense, by reducing him to a function in someone else's story and then moving on. There is one more line from the manuscript that has stayed with everyone who has seen the translation. After the passage describing Barabbas's release, the Ethiopian text includes a phrase not found in any of the 4 canonical Gospels. Translated from the Ge'ez, and it reads something like, "Tribon," and he went out from that place, and was seen no more among those who had known him. That is a specific way to describe disappearance. It implies he was still alive. It implies he went somewhere. It implies the people who knew him, people who would have known a man's name, a man's lineage, a man's cause, noticed that he was gone. It doesn't read like a contrast figure's exit. It reads like the sentence a historian writes when the subject of their account vanishes from the record, not because the person was insignificant, because something about their continued visibility had become inconvenient, was seen no more among those who had known him. Somewhere inside all of this, the priestly genealogies, the handwriting analyses, the 4th century council decisions, there is a person. A man who walked out of a Roman prison during Passover week in approximately 30 CE, who had been prepared to die for something and who, through a transaction the sources barely explain, didn't have to. Who then, according to that brief and haunting phrase, went somewhere and was seen no more. The Ethiopian text gives him a father, a lineage, a position in the political order of 1st century Jerusalem. He believed something strongly enough to end up in a Roman prison for it. He stood before a governor with someone else, sharing his name, and then he walked out into whatever was left of his life. We don't know where he went. We don't know if he understood, in that moment, what had just happened 20 feet away from him. We don't know if he ever learned the name that the man crucified in his approximate place would one day carry across the entire world. That's worth sitting with, because for 1,700 years, the version of this story we've had didn't allow that question. The version we inherited gave him a function and removed him from the stage. The Ethiopian tradition, in a manuscript that sat untranslated on a stone shelf in a cliffside library, appears to have thought he was worth more than that. The manuscript page is now in a cataloging facility in Addis Ababa. Access to the full collection it came from is currently restricted. The monastery in Tigray sustained structural damage during the 2020 to 2022 war. Some of the cliff face rooms have been assessed as unstable. The monks who fled have been returning slowly. Your researchers who applied for access to the full collection in 2023 received no response. A follow-up request in 2024 was acknowledged, but not acted upon. The collection is described in official correspondence as under review, clean language, bureaucratic, restrained. The particular silence of an institution that moves slowly and a world that doesn't wait. Whatever else is in those rooms, whatever other pages sit wrapped in cloth on those smoke-blackened shelves, it stays there for now, unread. Whatever other names are waiting in the Ge'ez, this is how it works. Not fire, not deletion, just access, withheld, just under review. The same mechanism that turned Jesus Barabbas into simply Barabbas across 17 centuries of manuscript copying. Not a dramatic suppression, a quiet, patient removal, one name at a time. Yet the Garima Gospels, the famous ones, the ones that have been photographed and published and celebrated as the oldest illustrated Christian manuscripts on earth, are now conserved under proper conditions, climate-controlled, known, studied. But the Garima Gospels are 4 books. The Ethiopian Bible has 81, and not all of them have had their wrappings removed. So here's where this leaves us. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. The councils that shaped the Western canon made specific, documented decisions about what to include and what to remove. Those decisions were institutional. They were made by people with theological stakes, political contexts, and audiences they were writing for. They excluded texts that contained genealogical detail. They excluded texts that named people. They excluded texts that preserved, yet in the Book of Jubilees, the kind of granular priestly lineage information that could, if cross-referenced carefully enough, give a man like Barabbas an identity he was never supposed to have in the surviving record. The Ethiopian Church kept those texts, not as an act of defiance, not as a preservation project, as scripture, as what the Bible was. And in a monastery carved into a cliff in northern Ethiopia, in a room the war did not quite reach, a page survived that named a man. The Gospels reduced to 2 lines and a function. Which brings us to the only question that matters now. Either what survived in Ethiopia is expansion. Later editions layered onto a simpler original story by scribes who wanted the narrative to feel more complete. Genuine but secondary. Interesting but not what was there at the beginning. Or what survived in Ethiopia is what was there before the editing happened. A tradition that preserved the fuller version of a narrative that the canonical Gospels, for their specific purposes and their specific audiences, deliberately simplified. If the first, a fascinating footnote. Scholars continue. If the second, the man the Gospels called Barabbas was a real person with a real name, a real family, a real lineage, and a real reason for standing in that courtyard on that morning. And for 1,700 years, we've been reading a version of the story that removed him on purpose, not with fire, but with omission, one name at a time. One manuscript copy at a time, until Jesus became just Barabbas, until Barabbas became just a criminal, until a criminal became just a plot device. Was he erased because he was irrelevant? Or because knowing who he actually was would have changed how we understood everything happening around him? If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to ask the same question. There are 77 more books in the Ethiopian Bible that the Western Church voted out. This was one page from one of them. We haven't opened the rest yet.